executing a 14-year-old child, and it took 70 years to admit the mistake. Can you believe it? A child only 14 years old, still in school, still playing soccer with friends, was accused, put on trial, and ultimately executed. And only after 70 years, when it was far too late, did they finally admit it was a mistake. An innocent child sentenced to death for a crime he didn't commit. This isn't a movie, it's the dark reality of American history. Watch until the end to understand why this truth was hidden for so long. If you're interested in shocking cases like this, make sure to hit subscribe, like, and leave a comment below. Now, let's begin. The child taken away and never returned. The story began on March 11, 1944, in a small town in South Carolina, USA. It was a sweltering morning like any other, but the town of Alcolu would never be the same again. In a modest house in the rural countryside, George Stinney Jr, a 14-year-old black boy, was sitting at lunch with his brother. Suddenly, two white girls, Betty June Bineker, 11 years old, and Mary Emma Thames, 7 years old, rode by on their bicycles. They asked George and his brother if they had seen any daisies nearby. George pointed toward a patch of trees. The two girls continued pedaling away. But that was the last time anyone ever saw them alive. The next day, the bodies of the two girls were found by the railroad tracks, their heads bludgeoned by a heavy object. There were no witnesses, no DNA evidence. Yet the police immediately arrested George Stinney Jr. Why? Because he was the last person seen talking to the two girls. That was all it took. No evidence, no lawyer, no one to defend him. The interrogation without parents, George was taken away from his family. Police interrogated him for hours without any guardian present. A 14-year-old boy, small and frail, was locked in a tiny room. No food, no rest. By the end of the day, the police announced George had confessed. There was no audio recording, no signed transcript, only the word of the officers, claiming that George admitted to killing the two girls because he wanted to rape them. It was absurd. George was only 5 feet tall, 155 meters, and weighed less than 95 pounds, about 43 kilograms. Meanwhile, the bodies of the girls had been dragged over 100 meters and bludgeoned with a railroad spike larger than George himself. His family protested, but they were poor, they were black, and this was 1944 when racial segregation and prejudice in the American South were still at their most brutal. The trial lasted 3 hours. The day of the trial finally came, but for George's family, it was nothing more than a formality to legitimize an outcome that had been decided long before. The boy had no real attorney to defend him. The court-appointed lawyer did only the bare minimum. He called no witnesses, presented no evidence in George's favor, and never questioned the police testimony. In the cramped courtroom, the all-white jury of 12 people sat silently listening to the accusations. All they had was the vague confession the police claimed George had made. No fingerprints, no blood, no physical evidence at all. Yet no one seemed to have any doubts. The trial lasted less than 3 hours. Everything unfolded like a play that had been rehearsed in advance. After just 10 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned. A man stood up and coldly read the verdict: guilty, death by electric chair. The courtroom fell into a deathly silence. George's mother could not bear the shock. She burst into tears and collapsed onto the floor, unconscious. His father, a man who had spent his life working on plantations, was held outside in the hallway by guards, not allowed to enter and hear the sentence that would end his son's life. The court declared that the execution would take place just 84 days after the trial. No appeals, No time to prepare. A child, not even old enough for high school, never truly treated as a citizen, was now to be punished as a fully grown murderer with no mercy whatsoever. In the empty stare of George, you could see a fear beyond imagining and a quiet resignation, as if he already understood there was no way back. The day George sat in the electric chair, June 16, 1944. That morning was unbearably hot, the air so stifling it felt like it was pressing down on everyone. Just 2 months earlier, George had celebrated his 14th birthday in his family's small home. But today he was led out of his cell, walking down the cold hallway toward the execution chamber. The guards watched the frail black boy in silence. None of them had ever seen someone so small being taken to die. George was still wearing clothes far too big for his thin frame. His face was pale, his eyes wide open, so terrified he could no longer even cry. When they arrived, it became clear the electric chair, built for adults, was too tall for him. George was so light he couldn't sit securely, so they stacked several telephone directories under him to raise him high enough. In that moment, everyone who witnessed it felt their throats tighten, the sight of a 14-year-old child swallowed up by the death chair looking as fragile and helpless as a doll. The executioner placed the large metal helmet over George's head, but the helmet was too big, covering his entire face so it was no longer visible. Thick cables were wrapped around his wrists and ankles. Everything was ready. The moment the switch was flipped, George's body convulsed violently. A 12,400-volt current tore through him. The crackle and sound filled the small chamber, making some guards turn away. The shock was so powerful that the metal helmet flew off his head and clattered onto the cold floor. For a split second, George's small face was revealed, his eyes bulging, a single tear still clinging to his cheek. Witnesses later said it was an image that haunted them for the rest of their lives. A skinny child, his face frozen in unimaginable fear, his body convulsing and contorting on that oversized chair. No one who saw it could truly believe he was the brutal murderer the verdict had claimed. But it was too late. When the courtroom outside fell silent, in less than a minute, justice had been carried out in a way that history would later call by its true name, a crime made legal by a sentence. 70 years of silence, and then the truth emerged. After the day George was executed, everything fell into silence. The case files were sealed away, locked deep in the drawers of the South Carolina court. No one was allowed to look at them again. George's family had to pack up the few belongings they had left and leave the town of Alcolu in the night, afraid of retaliation or harassment. For many years, none of them dared to speak George Stinney Jr.'s name, as if it were a stain that could never be washed away. For decades, the town quietly carried on, pretending nothing had ever happened. The people who had grown up with George, the guards who had watched him sit in the electric chair. No one spoke up. Fear and the weight of guilt made them choose silence, but time moved on. By the early tens, America had begun to re-examine its dark history of racial discrimination. Many historians and young lawyers decided they would not let this case be forgotten forever. In 2010, a group of attorneys, researchers, and George's surviving relatives began a long, difficult journey to reopen the case after nearly 70 years. They tracked down crumbling documents, vague transcripts, and the last remaining witnesses. With every page they turned, the truth became clearer and more painful. They discovered George had never had a real defense attorney. The court-appointed lawyer was only there in name, doing nothing to protect him. There was no forensic evidence whatsoever, no fingerprints, no eyewitness testimony placing George at the scene. George's so-called confession had no written record or signature and was almost certainly coerced during interrogation. A new witness came forward saying that at the time of the murders, George had been far from the crime scene helping his parents with work. After months of investigation and collecting testimony, the South Carolina court convened a special hearing. On December 17, 2014, Judge Carmen Mullen read the final decision to vacate the entire 1944 conviction against George Stinney Jr. She declared justice was not served in this case. George was officially exonerated of murder. His name was restored to honor, but it was all far too late. He had died nearly 70 years before when he was only 10 years old. In the courtroom, his family held each other and wept, feeling both relief and bitterness, because sometimes justice only arrives when the person it was meant for is no longer alive to receive it. The reaction and the lingering pain. The day the court officially declared George innocent, his family finally heard the words "not guilty" spoken aloud by a judge. They broke down in tears, partly with relief, but mostly with bitterness, because the justice they had waited for nearly 70 years had arrived too late, after the mother had already passed away, never living to see her son's name cleared. George's sister, by then in her 80s, held a faded photo of her little brother in trembling hands. Through tears, she said, "My brother was never guilty. We had to stay silent our whole lives out of fear and shame. But today, the world finally knows the truth." News of the overturned conviction spread across America. Newspapers put the story on their front pages, and major TV networks covered it extensively. Many people were hearing for the first time about the 14-year-old black boy who was executed after a trial that lasted only a few hours. The African American communities reacted with anger and sorrow, while human rights activists called this case one of the clearest examples of the staggering injustice that racial prejudice could create. The lawyers who worked to reopen the case said that when they read the files, they could hardly believe they were real. No evidence, no defense attorney, no written confession, and yet a child was convicted and killed simply because of the color of his skin. George Stinney Jr. became officially recognized as the youngest person executed in the United States in the 20th century. But he was not just another name on a list of death row inmates. He became a symbol of how justice collapses when prejudice and fear overpower conscience. The pain left by this case did not belong only to George's family. It was a deep wound in the heart of America, a reminder that when society stays silent in the face of injustice, even children can become victims. And sometimes, justice comes only when there is no one left alive to receive it. One final question. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. What if George wasn't just a stranger in a history book, but your own child, your little brother, the kid who sat at the table every morning eating breakfast with your family? Could you accept this reality? A 14-year-old child who had never committed a crime, who hadn't even had a chance to grow up or see life beyond a small town, accused of murder with no evidence, dragged into court, sentenced to death in just a few hours, and finally killed by the very legal system that was supposed to protect him. And the most terrifying part, no one was ever held accountable. No police officer was tried for coercing a confession. No prosecutor ever apologized. No juror ever had to publicly express regret. They all quietly carried on with their lives, leaving behind a shattered family and an innocent child who died for nothing. If it weren't for the brave people who refused to let this case be forgotten, who painstakingly tracked down the old records and listened to the testimony no one cared about, perhaps the world would never have known this story at all. The story of an innocent child electrocuted to death because of adults' fear, prejudice, and cruelty. And so, do you still believe that justice is always right, that society is always fair, that the law never makes mistakes? Or will you start to wonder how many other Georges have been forgotten? George's story is not just an old case buried in a history book. It is a painful warning of how justice can turn into a crime when prejudice and human silence take over. It reminds us all that the law is not always right, and that if we don't speak up, if we don't stand up, even a child can be caught in that cruel machine, losing their childhood, losing their life, and leaving behind a wound that will never heal in the hearts of those who love them. If you believe this truth deserves to be known by many more people, please share this video, hit subscribe, and leave a comment below. Every share is a way to remind society that staying silent in the face of injustice is also a form of complicity. George is gone forever, but the memory of him and the lesson from his wrongful death must be remembered so that no other child ever has to endure such a cruel fate again. Summary of key information: name, George Stinney Jr., age at execution, residence Al-Kalu, South Carolina, USA. Charge: murder of two young girls. Sentence: death by electric chair, June 16, 1944. Exoneration in 20 time until the error was acknowledged. 20 years. Let this story live on as proof that true justice only exists when we never stop fighting for the truth.